Picture this. It's 1963, and General Motors just issued the corporate death sentence for performance. No racing, no factory hot rods, no engines over 330 cubic inches in mid-size cars. Period. The executives in their Detroit towers had spoken. Racing was dead at GM. But in a dimly lit garage in Pontiac, Michigan, a group of engineers were about to pull off one of the greatest acts of corporate rebellion in automotive history. They would build a car so fast, so dominant, that it would force GM's own executives to eat their words. A car that would birth an entire segment of American performance. A car that technically shouldn't have existed. The Pontiac GTO. 3 letters that would become synonymous with raw, unbridled American muscle. But here's the thing most people don't know. The 389 cubic inch engine that powered this legend? It was never supposed to be there. Not according to GM's rulebook, not according to the bean counters, not according to anyone except a small band of Pontiac engineers who decided that sometimes, to make history, you have to break a few rules. This is the story of how Pontiac's engineering underground outsmarted one of the most powerful corporations in the world. How they disguised a race engine as a street motor. How they slipped a 389 cubic inch monster into a car that was supposed to max out at 330. How they created a performance package so brilliant that by the time GM's executives figured out what was happening, it was too late to stop it. January 1963, General Motors headquarters, Detroit. The memo that would change everything hit the desks of division managers across the corporation. Effective immediately, GM was out of the racing business. No more factory-sponsored racing teams. No more performance development. And most importantly, no more than 330 cubic inches of displacement in A-body intermediate cars. The lawyers were nervous about safety. The accountants were worried about insurance. The executives were concerned about GM's image. Racing was dangerous. Racing was expensive. Racing was over. At Pontiac, the news landed like a bomb. For years, Pontiac had been climbing out of its reputation as an old person's brand. They'd been winning races, building performance, creating excitement. Chief engineer John DeLorean, yes, that DeLorean, had been transforming Pontiac into GM's performance division. The wide-track Pontiacs were selling. The Super Duty 421 was dominating drag strips. Pontiac was on fire. And now corporate was throwing water on the flames. But DeLorean wasn't the type to take no for an answer. Neither was engine specialist Bill Collins or chassis engineer Russ G. They knew that Pontiac needed performance to survive. They knew that young buyers wanted power. They also knew that GM's ban had a loophole so big you could drive a muscle car through it. The ban specifically mentioned factory racing programs and standard production models. It said nothing about option packages. It limited displacement in standard engines but didn't explicitly forbid larger engines as options. The corporate lawyers had written the rules thinking like lawyers, not like engineers. And engineers, especially Pontiac engineers, were very good at finding creative interpretations of rules. The plan was audacious in its simplicity. Take the existing Tempest Le Mans, a mild-mannered intermediate car. Create an option package that would include Pontiac's 389 cubic inch engine from the full-size Bonneville. Add a hotter camshaft, a 4-barrel carburetor, dual exhausts, and a limited slip differential. Price it right. Market it carefully. And most importantly, never call it a factory racing package. It was just options, completely legal options that happened to transform a grocery getter into a street terror. The 389 engine was already a legend in Pontiac circles. Introduced in 1959, it was an evolution of Pontiac's innovative V8 architecture. Unlike other GM divisions that used different engines for different applications, Pontiac had developed a single engine family where all displacements from 326 to 455 cubic inches shared the same external dimensions. The bore spacing was 4.62 inches. The deck height was 10.24 inches. The brilliance of this design meant a 389 would physically fit anywhere a 326 would fit. It was almost like Pontiac had been planning for this moment. The 389 they selected for the GTO wasn't just any 389. This was the high-performance variant, internally designated as the WS engine code. The bore measured 4.06 inches. The stroke was 3.75 inches. Total displacement came to 389 cubic inches, or 6.4 liters in modern terms. The compression ratio was set at 10.75.1, right on the edge of what pump gas could handle. This wasn't some mild-mannered street engine pretending to be something special. This was a legitimate performance power plant hiding in plain sight. The standard GTO engine, if you can call anything about the GTO standard, featured a single Carter AFB 4-barrel carburetor flowing 500 cubic feet per minute. The camshaft was what Pontiac called their EO67 grind, with 288 degrees of advertised duration and 407 inches of lift on both intake and exhaust. These weren't radical specifications, but they were perfectly balanced for street performance. The hydraulic lifters meant no valve adjustments. The cast-iron exhaust manifolds looked stock, but flowed better than most headers of the era. Power output was conservatively rated at 325 horsepower at 4,800 RPM and 428 pound-feet of torque at 3,200 RPM, conservative because Pontiac, like most manufacturers of the era, was playing games with their power ratings. Actual output was probably closer to 350 horsepower, but the real story wasn't the peak numbers. It was the massive torque curve that started at idle and pulled like a freight train all the way to redline. But here's where things got really interesting. That was just the base GTO engine. Pontiac also offered what they called the tri-power option, 3 Rochester 2GC 2-barrel carburetors arranged in a progressive linkage. The center carburetor handled normal driving, cracked the throttle past 60%, and the 2 outboard carburetors opened up, flooding the engine with 960 cubic feet per minute of airflow. The tri-power setup was rated at 348 horsepower, but it was really about throttle response and that incredible sound when all 3 carburetors opened up. The most exotic option was the 421 HO. Yes, you could technically get a 421 in a 1964 GTO, though only about 200 people did. This was the Super Duty 421 with the serial numbers filed off, cast iron heads with huge 2.11-inch intake valves and 1.77-inch exhaust valves, a mechanical camshaft with 319 degrees of duration and 460 inches of lift, forged pistons, 4-bolt main bearing caps. This was essentially a race engine that somehow found its way onto the option sheet. Power was rated at 370 horsepower, but that was laughable. Real output was well over 400. The transmission choices were equally impressive. The standard gearbox was a 3-speed manual with a floor shifter, but nobody ordered that. The real choice was between the 4-speed manual and the 2-speed Super Turbine 300 automatic. The 4-speed was a Muncie M20 wide ratio or M21 close ratio, depending on the rear axle ratio. These were bulletproof transmissions that could handle whatever the 389 could dish out. The Hurst shifter that controlled them became as iconic as the engine itself. The automatic might seem like the soft choice, but the Super Turbine 300 was a legitimate performance transmission. With a 1.76.1 first-gear ratio and a switch-pitch torque converter that could change stall speed on command, it was actually quicker than the manual in the quarter mile. The converter would stall at 2,300 RPM for normal driving, but flip a switch on the dash and it would flash to 3,000 RPM for maximum launch capability. But an engine alone doesn't make a muscle car. The chassis had to handle the power, and this is where Pontiac's engineers really showed their genius. The GTO package included heavy-duty springs and shocks calibrated specifically for performance driving. The front springs were rated at 386 pounds per inch compared to 290 for the standard Tempest. The rear springs went from 98 to 123 pounds per inch. The front anti-roll bar grew from 0.69 inches to 0.94 inches in diameter. These might seem like small changes, but they transformed the handling. The standard differential was a 10-bolt unit with 3.1 gears, but the real performance started with the optional Safety Track Limited Slip Differential. Available ratios ranged from 3.231 to 4.331, though most GTOs came with either 3.351 or 391 gears. The 3.5s were perfect for street driving with occasional drag racing. The 390s were for serious racers who didn't mind screaming down the highway at 4,000 RPM. The brakes were perhaps the GTO's weakest link. Drums all around, 9.5 inches in diameter. They were adequate for street driving, barely. But after a few hard stops from speed, brake fade became a real issue. The metallic brake lining option helped, but it came with its own problems like noise and rapid rotor wear. This was the one area where Pontiac's engineers admitted they'd compromised. Everything else about the GTO was over-engineered. The brakes were just enough. Pontiac knew they had something special, but they had to be careful about how they marketed it. Remember, this whole project existed in defiance of GM corporate policy. The name itself was a masterstroke of marketing. GTO stood for Gran Turismo Omologato, borrowed from Ferrari. It was cheeky, even arrogant, comparing a $3,000 Pontiac to exotic Italian Grand Tourers. The purists were outraged. The kids loved it, which was exactly the reaction Pontiac wanted. The initial sales projection for the GTO option package was 5,000 units for the 1964 model year. Pontiac figured that was a safe number that wouldn't attract too much attention from corporate. They were wrong by a factor of 6. Before the year was over, Pontiac had sold 32,450 GTOs. The demand was so intense that dealers were taking deposits on cars they wouldn't see for months. Some dealers were marking them up by 50% or more, and people were still buying them. What made the GTO so revolutionary wasn't just the engine, though that was certainly part of it. It was the complete package at a price regular people could afford. The base Tempest Le Mans Coupe started at $2,556. The GTO package added just $296. For less than $3,000, you got a car that could embarrass Corvettes, costing twice as much. The tri-power option added another $116. The 4-speed manual was $188. A fully loaded GTO with every performance option might hit $3,500, still thousands less than a comparable Corvette or European sports car. But the real genius of the GTO was how it flew under GM's corporate radar. On paper, it was just a Tempest with some options. The 389 engine? That was already approved for Pontiac's full-size cars. The transmission choices, standard GM units, the suspension upgrades, just heavy-duty components from the parts bin. Nothing about the GTO technically violated GM's rules. It was all in the combination, and nobody had said you couldn't combine options in creative ways. By the time GM executives realized what Pontiac had done, it was too late to stop it. The GTO was a sales phenomenon. Dealers couldn't keep them in stock. The automotive press was going crazy. Car and Driver ran a comparison test between a GTO and a Ferrari 250 GTO. It was tongue-in-cheek, sure, but the Pontiac didn't embarrass itself. The GTO was suddenly the most talked-about car in America. The performance was undeniable. A properly equipped GTO with the tri-power 389 and 3.90.1 gears could run the quarter mile in the low 14-second range at over 100 mph. Those were supercar numbers in 1964. 0 to 60 happened in about 6.5 seconds. Top speed was limited, more by aerodynamics and courage than power, somewhere north of 120 mph. But straight-line performance was only part of the story. What really set the GTO apart was its versatility. This wasn't some stripped-down, barely street-legal drag racer. It was a comfortable, well-equipped car that you could drive to work on Monday and race on Sunday. The interior featured bucket seats, a console with a rally clock, and a proper set of gauges. The wide-track suspension meant it actually handled respectably for a car of its size and weight. You could option it with air conditioning, power steering, even power windows. It was a performance car for the real world. The impact on the industry was immediate and profound. Within a year, every manufacturer was scrambling to build their own GTO fighter. Ford stuffed a 289 into the Fairlane and created the GT. Chrysler dropped a 383 into the Plymouth Satellite. Chevrolet finally got permission to build the Chevelle SS 396. The muscle car wars had begun, and it all started because a group of engineers at Pontiac decided that corporate rules were more like suggestions. But the real beauty of how Pontiac outsmarted GM goes even deeper. They didn't just create a car, they created a template that everyone would follow. Take a mid-size platform, the lightest body you could find. Install the biggest engine that would physically fit. Keep the price reasonable. Market it to young buyers. It was so simple, so obvious in retrospect, that everyone wondered why nobody had thought of it before. The underground network of Pontiac engineers and performance enthusiasts that made the GTO possible didn't stop there. They continued pushing boundaries, finding loopholes, interpreting rules creatively. When GM tried to limit engine displacement by body size, Pontiac figured out how to make their engines physically identical on the outside, regardless of displacement. When insurance companies started surcharging high-performance cars, Pontiac created the Ram Air packages that were technically dealer-installed options. The 1964 GTO's success forced GM to acknowledge reality. The performance market wasn't going away. Young buyers wanted fast cars. And if GM didn't build them, Ford and Chrysler would. By 1965, the corporate ban on performance was effectively dead. GM divisions were openly competing and racing again. The horsepower wars were in full swing. And it all happened because John DeLorean and his team decided that sometimes the best way to change corporate policy is to prove it wrong. The technical evolution of the GTO engine through the 1960s tells its own story of creative rule bending. The 1965 model got better flowing cylinder heads and a revised camshaft that broadened the torque curve. The 1966 version introduced the XS camshaft option with 301 degrees of duration and 0.214 inches of lift, good for an honest 360 horsepower with tri-power. The 1967 model brought the now legendary 400 cubic inch version, created by boring the 389 out to 4.12 inches. But perhaps the most audacious technical achievement was the Ram Air packages. Officially, these were over-the-counter parts that dealers could install. Unofficially, many came from the factory with mysterious option codes that nobody at GM Corporate seemed to notice. The Ram Air 3 used a radical camshaft with 308 degrees of duration and 470 inches of lift. The Ram Air 4 went even further with 320 degrees and 0.520 inches of lift. These were race engines wearing street clothes, and they were technically legal because they were dealer options. The backdoor mechanics who tuned these engines developed their own tricks. They figured out that the Quadrajet carburetor's secondary air valve spring could be adjusted for quicker opening. They discovered that grinding the face of the thermostat housing would increase coolant flow. They learned that indexing the spark plug so the ground electrode faced away from the intake valve was worth a couple of horsepower. These weren't factory modifications. These were the secrets passed between Pontiac engineers and selected dealers who understood what was really going on. The most famous of these underground tuners was Royal Pontiac in Royal Oak, Michigan. Owned by Ace Wilson Jr., Royal wasn't just a dealership. It was essentially Pontiac's Skunk Works racing operation. When GM was officially out of racing, Royal was winning NHRA championships with cars that were definitely not factory-supported, wink wink. The Royal Bobcat package included thin head gaskets to bump compression, recurved distributors for optimal timing, and rejetting that Pontiac definitely didn't officially approve of. Royal's mechanics would blueprint engines, a process where every component was measured and matched for optimal performance. They'd balance rotating assemblies to tolerances far beyond factory specifications. They'd port-match intake manifolds, smooth casting flash in the heads, and perform dozens of other modifications that added up to serious power gains. A Royal-prepped GTO could gain 30 to 40 horsepower without any obvious modifications. It would still look completely stock to anyone who didn't know exactly what to look for. The relationship between Pontiac engineering and these performance dealers was symbiotic. Dealers like Royal would develop modifications and feed information back to Pontiac. Engineers would then incorporate the best ideas into future production, always careful to maintain plausible deniability about any racing development. It was a shadow network of performance development that operated right under GM's nose. This underground movement reached its peak with the 1969 GTO Judge. Originally conceived as a budget-striped model to compete with the Plymouth Roadrunner, the Judge became something entirely different. The standard engine was the 366 horsepower Ram Air 3 400, but the real weapon was the Ram Air 4. Officially rated at 370 horsepower, everyone knew that was a joke. Real output was closer to 450 horsepower. The Ram Air 4 had aluminum intake manifolds, special cylinder heads with 2.11-inch intake valves, forged pistons, and a camshaft so radical that it barely idled. The Ram Air 4 was essentially a Super Duty engine that somehow made it into production. It required 104-octane fuel to prevent detonation. The valve springs were so stiff that they'd literally tear up the valve train if you tried to run regular hydraulic lifters. The engine was so highly strung that Pontiac recommended valve adjustments every 500 miles. This wasn't a street engine. This was a race engine that Pontiac somehow convinced GM was suitable for public consumption. The insurance companies eventually caught on. By 1970, muscle car insurance rates were astronomical. The government was starting to pay attention too. Safety advocates were calling these cars death traps. Emissions regulations were tightening. The party was coming to an end. But for 6 glorious years, Pontiac had shown the world what was possible when engineers refused to accept limitations. The death of the original GTO came in stages. The 1970 model was still strong, with the 455 cubic inch engine making up to 360 horsepower. The 1971 saw compression ratios drop to meet unleaded fuel requirements. By 1972, horsepower ratings switched from gross to net, making the engines look even weaker than they were. The 1973 model was a shadow of its former self. The 1974 was the last true GTO, and it was barely recognizable as a performance car. But the legacy of how the GTO was created lived on. The idea that engineers could find creative solutions to corporate restrictions, that enthusiasm and ingenuity could triumph over bureaucracy, that sometimes the best innovations come not from official programs, but from people who refuse to accept that something can't be done. The technical specifications might fade from memory. The horsepower numbers become historical footnotes. But the spirit of the GTO, that rebellious DNA that said rules were meant to be creatively interpreted, that became part of American automotive culture. Every tuner shop that figures out how to make power while staying emissions legal. Every manufacturer that finds loopholes in regulations. Every engineer who looks at a rule and asks, but what if we tried this? They're all following in the footsteps of those Pontiac engineers who decided that a corporate ban on performance was really just a suggestion. Modern performance cars owe everything to the GTO, the idea of taking a mundane platform and transforming it with power. The concept of the affordable performance car, the notion that regular people deserve exciting cars. It all started in 1964 when Pontiac proved that with enough creativity and determination, you could outsmart any rulebook. Today, surviving numbers matching 1964 GTOs with tri-power command six figures at auction. The Ram Air 4 cars are worth even more. But the real value isn't monetary. It's the proof that innovation doesn't always come from the top down. Sometimes it comes from engineers in back rooms, mechanics in dealership service bays, and enthusiasts who refuse to accept that fast cars are only for the wealthy. The Pontiac GTO didn't just outsmart GM's Rulebook. It rewrote the rules of what a performance car could be. It democratized speed. It proved that with enough ingenuity, any barrier could be overcome. And it showed that sometimes the best way to deal with corporate restrictions is to follow them so creatively that they become meaningless. That 389 cubic inch engine wasn't supposed to be in that car. Those performance options weren't supposed to exist. That whole culture of underground performance development wasn't supposed to happen. But it did, because a group of engineers decided that what America needed wasn't what corporate executives thought they should build. What America needed was excitement, performance, and proof that rules were made to be bent. The GTO was more than a car. It was a statement, a declaration that performance would not be regulated out of existence, that enthusiasm would find a way. That given the choice between following rules and making history, sometimes you have to choose history. John DeLorean and his team didn't just build a muscle car, they built a legend. And they did it by remembering one simple truth. The best way to predict the future is to build it yourself. Corporate rulebook be damned. What's your favorite story of automotive rebellion? Drop a comment below and let me know about the cars that broke the rules and made history. And if you want more stories about the engineers and designers who refuse to accept limitations, make sure to subscribe, because we're just getting started exploring the underground history of American performance.